Hello, chess enthusiasts! Welcome back to the Chess Ventura channel. In today's video, we're going to discuss a very exciting game played by the strongest female chess player of all time, none other than Judit Polgar. This game features Judit Polgar facing off against former world champion Vishy Anand. In this match, we'll witness a beautiful display of skill by Judit Polgar, forcing Vishy Anand to resign after just 34 moves. Alright, let's dive straight into the game. In the game, Polgar played as white, while Anand controlled the black pieces. The game begins with white playing the pawn to e4, and Anand responding with the Sicilian defense, pawn to c5. White develops the knight to f3, black plays pawn to d6, and then white advances pawn to d4, initiating an exchange of pawns. After black captures the pawn, Judit recaptures with her knight. Anand then develops his knight to f6, attacking the central e4 pawn. Naturally, white defends this pawn by advancing the knight to c3. So far, we've seen the most common moves in the Sicilian defense. Black has several options here, such as developing the knight to c6, advancing pawn to a6, or pushing the pawn to g6. In this case, Vishy Anand chooses the Najdorf variation with pawn to a6, aiming to control the b5 square and prepare for future pawn pushes. White develops the bishop to e3, and black replies with pawn to e6. On move 7, Judit Polgar plays aggressively by pushing the pawn to g4, aiming to threaten black's knight with a potential g5 push. This move is rarely played at the top level because advancing the g4 pawn weakens white's kingside, especially when the bishop hasn't yet developed and the king is still in the center of the board. However, let us remember that the player making these moves is one of the strongest grandmasters of her time, widely regarded as the greatest female chess player in history. In response to white's threats, Anand advances the pawn to e5, attacking the knight and simultaneously pressuring the g4 pawn. White's knight jumps to f5, but black counters by attacking the knight with the pawn to g6. Judit responds by pushing the g5 pawn, launching a counterattack on the knight on f6. Black's best move here is to capture the knight with the pawn, which is exactly what Anand does. But instead of recapturing black's knight, Judit boldly takes the pawn on f5, a daring move. The idea behind this move is that if black retreats the knight, say to d7, white can bring the queen to h5. If black then pushes the pawn to d5, white can castle queenside. After black advances the pawn to d4, white can position the bishop on c4. This sequence highlights white's aggressive attack, creating significant challenges for black in the subsequent moves. In the actual game, Anand decides not to save his knight, and instead advances the pawn to d5, introducing the threat of pushing to d4, which would create a double attack on the knight and bishop. But instead of defending her pieces, Judit boldly brings her queen to f3. Black continues with the pawn push to d4. White castles queenside, simultaneously pinning black's d4 pawn to the black queen. Anand then develops the knight from b8 to d7, renewing the threat against white's pieces. In this position, if white captures the knight on f6, black can respond by taking the knight on c3 with the pawn. This would introduce a new threat, the pawn capturing on b2. If white tries to defend with b3 or captures the c3 pawn, black gains a strong position. The weakened dark squares in white's position would provide opportunities for black's queen and dark-squared bishop to exploit. Therefore, in the original game, white played bishop to d2. Black responded by capturing the knight with the pawn, and white recaptured with the bishop. At this point, white had lost a pair of knights, while black's pieces remained intact. Now, let's see how Judit Polgar turned the game around despite being down in material. Anand continued with bishop to g7. White then placed the rook on g1, occupying the semi-open file. As we can see, black's knight on f6 is still threatened by a pawn, but black decides to sacrifice the knight and instead castles kingside. A very bold move given that white's rook is now aligned with black's king on the same file. Despite this, according to the engine, the position is still considered balanced. This means both players have an equal chance of winning the game. Judit proceeded by capturing the knight with the pawn, and Anand recaptured with the queen. Then, white's queen moved to e3, putting pressure on black's e5 pawn. Here, white threatens with a potential rook capture on the knight. With no remaining piece protecting the e5 pawn, white's dark-squared bishop could take the pawn, threatening both the queen and the bishop on g7. If this happens, black would likely lose, so Anand anticipated this move and moved his king to h8. Now, if white were to capture the knight with the rook, black wouldn't hesitate to take white's rook in return. If white played bishop to take the pawn, black could recapture with the queen, supported by the bishop on g7. White's attack would falter because the pin on black's dark-squared bishop would be broken. Returning to the original game after black's king moved to h8, white had to be cautious due to the threat of black's bishop on h6. White responded by pushing the pawn to f4, adding pressure on black's central pawns. With the material advantage, white challenged black to exchange queens on b6. If the exchange was accepted, the game would quickly enter the endgame, which would favor black. Therefore, white rejected the queen exchange with queen to g3, creating a potential threat of checkmate if the queen captures the bishop. Black defended the dark-squared bishop with the queen on h6, and then Judit Polgar played a beautiful move, rook to d6. Of course, this rook move wasn't free, because if black captured the rook, white's queen would immediately take the bishop and deliver a checkmate. So black blocked the rook's attack with a pawn push to f6. White continued with bishop to d2, black advanced the pawn to e4, and white moved the bishop to c4. Anand then tried to attack white's light-squared bishop with a pawn to b5. The bishop retreated to e6, increasing pressure on the knight on d7. Black responded with rook to a7, and Judit Polgar continued with rook to c6. Black pushed the pawn to a5. White responded by moving the bishop to e3, threatening black's rook. Anand saved the rook by moving it to b7, and white replied with bishop to d5. The idea was that if white captures the bishop on c8, white's bishop could then capture the rook on b7. Of course, black prevented this plan by moving the rook to b8. White continued with rook to c7. Now, white had successfully placed the rook on a very strong square, controlling the 7th rank. This position also naturally applied additional pressure to black's dark-squared bishop. Black responded with pawn to b4, and white countered with pawn to b3. At this point, the position was very difficult for black, and there weren't many good moves left for black to make. The best move for black here would have been rook to d8. However, Vishy Anand made a less accurate move by playing rook to b5, intending to drive the bishop away. This gave white the opportunity to play bishop to c6, creating a double attack on black's two pieces. Anand continued by capturing the pawn with his rook, but Judit did not immediately capture the knight. Instead, she captured the bishop with her rook. After the exchange of rooks, white then captured the knight, creating a fork and attacking both of black's rooks. Black responded by moving the rook to c5, and white's bishop captured the rook. Black recaptured with the rook, but now black was facing numerous weaknesses, particularly on the back rank and with the bishop on g7. Judit took advantage of these weaknesses by placing her rook on d1, threatening a check on d8. Feeling the pressure, Anand made a fatal mistake by moving his king to g8. After white's queen moved to g2, Vishy Anand resigned on move 34. You may be wondering why black resigned so quickly, even though both players were of equal material strength. While the material may seem balanced, white's position was clearly dominant over black's. As we can see, white's pieces are highly active and creating serious threats against black's king, while black's pieces are passive and not posing any significant threats. If the game had continued, for example, if black played queen to g6, white could capture the pawn on e4. If black then played h6, white could move the rook to g1, attacking black's queen. It's important to note that black's queen must protect the rook from white's queen, so black's queen would be forced to move to h5. White could then check with the queen on a8, and after black's king moved to h7, white's queen would move to b7, threatening checkmate in the following move. The best way for black to prevent checkmate would be to sacrifice the rook with a move to g5. However, after white captures the rook with the pawn, black would still be unable to stop white's attack in the following moves. Alright, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. If you liked this kind of video, don't forget to click like and subscribe. And if you have any feedback, suggestions, or critiques, feel free to share them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.